Order. Ross Savage to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to bring this very important debate. I'm grateful to the petitioner, John Bake, and to the more than 127,000 people who signed this petition, including 132 from my constituency of the South Cotswolds. This petition calls for a simple principle that trans people should be able to self-identify their legal gender without needing an intrusive medical diagnosis. For trans people to live with dignity, not bureaucracy, with compassion, not suspicion. It means allowing someone to change their legal gender through a statutory declaration. It already works effectively in countries such as Ireland, Argentina and Denmark. And it doesn't remove safeguards. False declarations remain a criminal offence. What it does do is remove unnecessary medicalised hurdles that dehumanise trans people and delay access to legal rights. Many trans people already live full-time in their affirmed gender without ever applying for a gender recognition certificate, precisely because the process is so inaccessible. The current system doesn't stop people from transitioning. It simply makes their lives harder, so much harder. The Liberal Democrats have long supported reform of the Gender Recognition Act to make it less bureaucratic and intrusive. Our party policy is clear. We support removing the requirement for medical reports, recognising non-binary identities in law and ending the spousal veto, the very proposals the Conservatives brought forward in 2018. And we believe in a wider approach too, expanding access to timely, high-quality healthcare and putting an end to all forms of conversion practices. I will give way.
I'm really grateful for giving way. I'm sure she'll note that setting out last month's Supreme Court judgment, Lord Hodge counselled against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. Nonetheless, it has caused immense distress to the trans community. Does she agree with me that now is the time for the government to commit to a clear timetable for allowing transgender people to self-identify their legal gender so that they can live with the dignity and respect, which is a basic human right?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. And yes, dignity and respect are exactly what we are talking about here, and I absolutely agree. Because for us, this is not about abstract debates. This is about real lives. This is about human beings and the right, the fundamental human right to live safely, freely and in their own truth. Yet today we find ourselves in a situation where one of society's smallest minorities is being targeted with hostility and violence. According to the 2021 census, only 0.5% of adults in England and Wales identified as trans or gender diverse, and yet entire newspaper front pages and hours of political debate are dedicated to their existence. This toxic and hostile debate has real-world consequences. According to the Office for National Statistics, hate crimes against trans people have risen by close to 200%. Since 2018. In 2023, of the nearly 5,000 transphobic hate crimes reported, only 126 led to prosecution. That is less than 3%. This is not acceptable. Nearly half of all trans and gender diverse individuals have experienced sexual assault. Nearly half. Trans women without access to gender affirming care are significantly more likely to attempt suicide. 1 in 5 will try. And while this is often painted as a culture war, the human cost is painfully real. Take Joelle. I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and it deeply saddens me to hear some of those statistics. Would the Honourable Member agree with me that what we say in this House matters? It ripples across communities. And regardless of what side you sit on or where you are in the argument, at the centre of that argument are people. Does the Honourable Member also agree with me that we should be doing our utmost to protect the trans community and ensure they have the same rights as everyone else and that they can live in dignity?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention and wholeheartedly agree with his remarks and associate myself with them. Take, for example, Joelle, a trans woman who died of an eminently treatable cancer after waiting for 8 days on a general ward because clinicians couldn't agree on where she should be placed, a men's ward or a women's ward. That delay in treatment cost her her life. Not to mention the recent Supreme Court ruling and the devastating impact its implications are having on trans people who are just trying to get on with living their lives. I will give way.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to serve on your chairmanship, Mr. Mundell. I have many constituents who have been really affected by the High Court ruling, and one who I want to highlight works in the ambulance service and has breasts and uses women's changing facilities without any issue. Were she to be forced into using other facilities, it would declare to everybody her transgender status, and she has lived and has a gender recognition certificate as a woman. Does the honourable member agree that there is a real mess now created by this legal ruling which does need sorting out?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I am very keenly aware of the distress that has been caused by this Supreme Court ruling, and it seems to fly in the face of common sense when somebody who is clearly living life as a female would, under this ruling, have to go into male spaces. It just beggars belief. And this ruling doesn't only hurt trans people. It hurts any woman who doesn't conform to feminine norms, who may be challenged on entering a women's space. This isn't just a legal rollback for trans rights, it is also a rollback for women's rights. A recent survey response from a parent said, "I'm primarily worried about my trans daughter's safety as a result of the ruling, but I'm also worried about my cis daughter's future and the increasing pressure to conform to restrictive gender stereotypes." A trans person responding to the same survey wrote, "Stress, anxiety and uncertainty for the future. More and more, I feel like I'm having to shrink my life for my own protection." I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Mundell. I'm struck by not only the Supreme Court ruling, but also the interim guidance by the EHRC, which is causing extreme distress to a number of my constituents. And I'm now reassured, actually I'm having to rely on Margate Pride's own advice to their businesses to reassure them that there are things about that ruling and the guidance that they should be taking into account, that it's not legally binding, doesn't change the law. Businesses shouldn't feel pressure to rewrite or roll back their trans-inclusive policies based on that draft guidance alone. Mr Mundell, Chair, this is not a situation which is acceptable for anyone to be in, where interim guidance by the EHRC is causing more stress and anxiety than the initial ruling, and that anybody that thinks that this Supreme Court guidance, that ruling, is drawing a line and making things clear is greatly mistaken.
Yeah.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention and absolutely agree this already vulnerable group, many of whom already struggle with mental health issues, are struggling even more as a result of the confusion arising from the ruling. So to return to the quote from a trans person responding to this survey, feeling that they have to shrink their life for their own protection. They say, "When discussions of safety have taken place in Parliament, there is a complete lack of empathy for the invalidation and fear that trans individuals are experiencing." Well, I say to that person and other people in the trans community, I hope that they are witnessing the empathy that is being expressed in this hall today. The government must modernise, simplify, clarify and reform the intrusive and outdated gender recognition law and bring in a new process like they promised at the last general election. We're being told the current system is robust. But how can a system be robust when over 31,000 people are still waiting just for their first appointment at a gender identity clinic? Some will wait for more than 7 years. Many will never make it through the process, not because they lack the seriousness, but because the bureaucracy is unbearable, as is the toll on their mental health. Public Health England has said that over a third of trans people attempt suicide at least once. This is a human tragedy unfolding as a result of the lack of suitable support and enough resources to see trans people through this process. I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and Mr Mundell, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I also look at the Supreme Court ruling and that point where the judge said that the Equality Act does apply to trans people. Does the Honourable Lady agree with me that we have been failing trans people for many, many years in this country, despite the fact that they are covered by the Equality Act, and this has to change?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention and wholeheartedly agree that equality means equality, no matter who the individual concerned may be. Even the government's much lauded £5 GRC fee is meaningless when the necessary private medical reports, blood tests and hormone prescriptions cost thousands. This is simply inaccessible to many, many people. This is not a system of integrity. It's a system of delay, expense, quiet exclusion leading to quiet desperation. Meanwhile, there are some rays of hope. Organisations like the Trans Legal Clinic are stepping in to fill the gap. Founded just 3 years ago, the clinic now supports trans people across the UK with legal issues relating to discrimination, housing, gender-based violence and access to care. Their staff are unpaid. Their clients often arrive in crisis and their work is saving lives. So now, their message to us as parliamentarians is clear. Legal recognition reduces suicide risk. Gender recognition reform would directly improve mental health outcomes. We need to get past this toxic debate and focus on the urgent reality of trans people who face violence, homelessness and systemic neglect. And I would like to end this speech with a simple reflection. There are, as far as I'm aware, no trans MPs in this chamber, but we all have trans constituents and we all have the capacity to imagine. Imagine waking up tomorrow exactly as you are, same body, same mind, but the world is treating you as somebody that you're not. They call you by the wrong name. They dismiss what you say because they don't see beyond that gender issue. And that is the daily experience of many trans people in the UK. We cannot ask... I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I think she's made a very comprehensive opening statement on behalf of the Petitions Committee, so I thank her for that. Does she agree with me that actually it's trans voices that are often left out when we talk about these issues and this debate? And actually we need to remember that there are humans on the other side of this, and that we need to be listening to our trans community when we are making decisions that directly impact their lives.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I will say that I've worked very closely with a member of my team who is a trans person in preparing for this speech today, and it has been absolutely eye-opening for me as a cis woman to find out so much more about the toll taken on members of the trans community as they try to navigate these impossible systems. There is so much more that I could have put in this speech today that would only, I think, arouse even more compassion. So in my own small way, I'm doing what I can today to try and be that voice of the trans community that, as the honourable member has pointed out, is not heard enough in this debate. So to any trans person who is listening to this debate today, please know that even in a parliament where your voice is still too often missing, there are people here who see you, who hear you, and who will fight for your right to be yourself. We have a choice as parliamentarians. We can stoke fear and division, or we can show leadership. Let's choose dignity, let's choose compassion, let's choose to recognise people for who they are as individuals and give them the legal recognition and protection that they deserve. Thank you.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. I'm not going to set a time limit, but if members keep to around 7 minutes, everyone will get to make a meaningful contribution. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 701159 relating to transgender people self-identifying their legal gender, and I call Richard Quigley.
It is to serve under your chairship, and may I begin by thanking the honourable member for South Cotswolds even for securing this important debate. Whilst as MPs we need to respect the independence and authority of the judiciary, the recent ruling doesn't solve anything. It is our duty to respect, however, let us be clear, this ruling does not absolve us from our ongoing responsibility to the trans community. Our duty to respect, support and advocate for their rights remains as vital as ever. I am deeply troubled by the rhetoric that has taken hold in recent years, rhetoric appropriated by those seemingly seeking to sow division and manufacture culture wars at the expense of people who already face hardship and discrimination in our society. It is disheartening to see figures, including the Leader of the Opposition, appear to wear their transphobia almost as a badge of honour. In this House, we must not forget that our words matter, and we can really impact the most vulnerable. I came into politics, as I believe many of us did, to champion minorities and to give a voice to the voiceless. It is vital that we remember the power we hold, to raise the tone of debate rather than to lower it, to support the vulnerable, not scapegoat them. Trans people simply want to live in peace, not to be demonised or turned into a convenient political target during times of national difficulty. Our constituents, by and large, are not fixated on which toilets people use. They want change, they want lives to improve, they want well-funded services. What concerns me further is the growing narrative that improving trans rights somehow threatens the rights or dignity of women and girls. And I am not going to deny that in places such as the prison service, there have been troubling examples of individuals playing the system to gain access to women's spaces. We must acknowledge and address these concerns seriously. But when I hear some from the opposition benches declare themselves, well, if they were here, champions of women's rights, I find myself asking, where are they now? But where have they been for the last 15 years? When violence against women and girls skyrocketed, where was the legislation? When women's shelters were chronically underfunded, where was the outrage? When domestic abuse cases surged while court access diminished, where was the action? When male perpetrators played the legal system to harass their victims, where was the advocacy? I do not raise these points just to score political points, but rather to prompt reflection. If your defence of women's rights only surfaces in opposition to trans rights, then I question whether it is truly about supporting women or simply targeting trans people under that guise. I stand here not to provoke arguments, but to urge every member in this chamber to remember the human beings behind our words, their families, their communities, their lives. Hate crimes against trans people are rising. If we as MPs do not accept some responsibility for the tone and consequences of our discourse, then we are failing in our duty. I will.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he really highlights this really important point. So many people have been in touch with me, very frightened now because of this this Supreme Court ruling. Doesn't he agree? As he said, we need to speak well here, but the government needs to make sure that that interim guidance is fast firmed up into proper guidance, because the interim guidance is causing confusion and fear among so many people.
I thank the honourable lady for intervention. I do agree entirely. Words matter, as we've seen many times. Over the last 14 years, words do indeed matter. Ultimately, I believe the petition before us is rooted in compassion, dignity and a call for basic respect, principles that are, I believe, unmistakably British. Respect for others, fairness and standing up for the vulnerable are values we rightly take pride in. I hope we can all agree on this simple truth, that trans people are not the enemy, and that the power we hold in this place must be used to uplift, not to vilify. My message to all of us here today is this: let us not lose sight of that responsibility. Thank you, Chair.
I call Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr Dell. Thank you for chairing this meeting for us today. And I'd like to congratulate the member from the South Cotswolds for moving this on behalf of the Petitions Committee. I want to focus on some of the text of the petition and talk about specifically what you need a gender recognition certificate for and what you don't need a gender recognition certificate for. You do not need a gender recognition certificate to update your driving licence. You don't need one to update your passport. You don't need one to update your medical records, your employment records or your bank account. And you don't need one to go into a toilet or a changing room. You don't need a birth certificate either to go into a toilet or a changing room, I hasten to add. What you do need a gender recognition certificate for, what the point of them is, what the reason for them is to allow you to update your birth or your adoption certificate, which allows you the right of privacy, the human right of privacy, to allow you to get married or form a civil partnership in your affirmed gender, which again allows you that privacy. It allows you and your partner to have the correct genders on the marriage or civil partnership agreement. It allows you as well to update your marriage or civil partner certificate, and it allows you to have your affirmed gender on your death certificate when you die. Can you imagine if your partner or your father or your mother or your child dies and they have to have the wrong gender on their death certificate? Can you imagine how that can compound the misery that you are already feeling? Those are the things that a gender recognition certificate allows you to do. It might change your pension entitlements as well. For some people that is really important because they're not getting the correct pension entitlements, particularly if their partner dies. And you can apply to have a gender recognition certificate even if you've not had any surgery or any treatments. Now, the member for the South Cotswolds mentioned the issues that there are with gender-affirming care, with gender identity clinics, with the extremely long waiting times that there are, even for those initial appointments. Can you imagine if people did not have to have a gender dysphoria diagnosis in order to apply for a gender recognition certificate? They wouldn't even need to see the gender identity clinic, should they not wish to.
Just to say, doesn't she agree with me that other jurisdictions have implemented the legal self-declaration of gender without any detriment and actually without any of the debates that have come in this country, even without those reforms? For instance, Ireland are 10 years into their self-declaration of legal gender act. Isn't it time that we moved with those other jurisdictions?
I completely agree, and as the member for South Cotswold said, there is still a legal requirement not to lie. There is still powers in place in order to punish you should you lie when you apply for that gender recognition certificate. Focusing specifically on that medical issue, we have very few practitioners across these islands who are competent and trained and working in this area. If we free up some of that clinical time, everybody, those people who do need gender-affirming surgery, those people who do need treatment, will get that treatment far more quickly because the queue will shorten, because they will not need that gender dysphoria diagnosis. And you can also, should you choose, as a government putting forward new legislation, choose to have other rules in place around it. There are already other rules in place around getting a gender recognition certificate. This specific petition focuses on the gender dysphoria diagnosis. It doesn't focus on the fact that you've got to provide 2 years' worth of evidence. So you could still, should you desire, have 2 years' worth of evidence need to be provided, which is something from every 3-month period in at least the last 2 years that says that refers to you in your Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. That talks about you in your new name, that shows and proves that you have been living in that gender. You could still require all of that and still take out the gender dysphoria diagnosis and make things so much better for people. As the member said, and as a number of members have said, what has happened around the Supreme Court ruling has made things even more complicated, even more confusing for people. It has not provided the clarity, and we're in this really weird situation of limbo right now, where a huge number of pubs, restaurants, shops who are just trying to do their best don't know what exactly they have to do, because they've got a position of interim guidance, which frankly is not very clear if you have read it. They've also got the court ruling, they've also got the Equality Act to look at, and they don't know what toilets they should be providing for people. Absolutely.
thank the honourable member for giving way. I have heard the argument, and as a member of the Justice Select Committee, I've inquired further into this, that what the Supreme Court did was to give an interpretation of the meaning of sex within the confines of the Equality Act 2010, and it is now for the government to legislate further to protect trans people.
So I'm not a lawyer, Mr Mundell, but my reading of it is that what they tried to do was to work out what was in the minds of those politicians who passed the Equality Act in 2010, which is a difficult thing to do because I can't tell you what's in my mind right now, never mind 15 years ago. They tried to interpret that, and they came down on the side of saying that the politicians were talking about biological sex, and that single-sex spaces, for example, although actually the Equality Act mainly focuses on things like discrimination rather than on single-sex spaces, which is a tangential side mention in the Equality Act, that you can only be discriminated against now, my understanding, is on the basis of biological sex or on the basis of your transgender identity, not your transgender gender, your transgender identity as the fact that you are a transgender person, which removes a huge amount of protection for transgender people. So I'm massively concerned. I think that the only way that we're going to get clarity is if the government does step up and make a change to the Equality Act.
Briefly, I appreciate Mr Mundell, the Honourable Lady, giving way. Does she not agree that the Equality Act itself was well written in order to deal with intersectional issues when they arose? The guidance around it was very clear, and that this ruling has muddied that. And as you say, as the Honourable Lady says, Mr Mundell has highlighted that now the government may need to step in to resolve this.
I do agree, and actually the court ruling decision made clear that the Scottish Government had acted in line with the EHRC's guidance, but it was the guidance that was wrong because it should have been done on the basis of biological sex, not on gender. Just lastly, Mr Mundell, I'm aware I'm pushing up against the time. I wanted to mention the EHRC, and I am also concerned about the direction of travel with the EHRC. I think that it would be sensible to have an independent body look at making these decisions. I think given the EHRC's current positioning, given the comments that the EHRC have made, given that a few weeks ago I was at a 15 years celebration of the Equality Act, and a number of people from LGBT Alliance and also Sex Matters people were invited to that celebration of the Equality Act, while there was only one transgender person in the room. And I am concerned that the EHRC is not able to be an unbiased arbiter of the law in this. And that, actually, I think they've got a really impossible job right now, because you cannot interpret the Equality Act on the basis of biological sex. It doesn't make sense unless you're going to tell everybody that they've got to have 3 toilets, if you're defining all toilets as single-sex spaces, and if businesses are going to be required to continue to have single-sex toilets. I mean, the easiest way for them to solve this would be to say that every business just has to have unisex toilets for everybody, because then everyone would be able to access every toilet. And I actually don't think that's a position that we want to get to. I don't think we want to get there. So the only option that the government has is either to talk to the EHRC and ensure that they are being completely unbiased, but actually changing the Equality Act so it's totally clear what it means, so it's clear what the definition of sex is, and it's clear that we are actually here trying to protect the human rights, particularly the right to privacy, the right to die in a dignified death, the right that trans people should have in their gender, in their affirmed gender, if that's the phrase that you want to use. I think we're failing right now, and that changes need to be made in order to protect our constituents.
Josh Newbury.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time. According to the Rainbow Map, which ranks European countries based on their legal and policy practices for LGBT people, we are now in the United Kingdom as low down as 22nd. But bear in mind that just 10 years ago we were at the top of that list, and since we have slowly but surely made our way down it. Let's be clear, trans people in this country are facing a wave of hostility, misinformation and marginalisation. And regardless of our position on the topic of this petition, that should concern us all. Some organisations have jumped the gun on restricting access to single-sex spaces in advance of the full Equalities and Human Rights Commission guidance on a misguided belief that they are following an updated law. And the interim guidance, I'm afraid, as has been said already by other honourable members, does nothing to help this and actually exacerbates this situation, particularly the inexplicable assertion that in some circumstances the law also allows trans women not to be permitted to use the men's facilities and trans men not to be permitted to use the women's facilities. In other words, that trans people are excluded from all single-sex spaces. And for me, it's the vigilante enforcement of this so-called guidance, which is perhaps the most toxic and damaging aspect of all. Toilets are becoming ideological battlegrounds, with the casualties including not just trans people, but cisgender women who are not stereotypically female. What is clear is that there is no adequate test for determining if a person should now have access to a single-sex space, except a DNA test perhaps, which is clearly not going to happen in a toilet, a refuge or anywhere like that. So out there, and perhaps in this place too, access is being based on whether a person appears to be a certain gender, whether they adhere to gender norms. Now, I thought we had left outdated notions of what a woman should look like and sound like, where they belong, in the past. But now they are being dredged back up, and worst of all, that's being done by people who call themselves feminists. But the toxicity in this debate is not new. In this House, successive Conservative governments not only failed to defend the trans community and advance their rights, they actively stoked division and rolled back the clock. Now today, while there are calls for wider reforms, including around gender recognition and self-identification, we must be honest about the political and social climate we are currently in as well. These are such important conversations, and they require the right timing, they require sensitivity, and not culture wars. Over the last decade, both in the UK and globally, a lot has happened. But I worry that we have started to channel wider fears into isolating an already marginalised group who just want to live their lives with the same dignity and respect that so many of us take for granted. A survey from Stonewall in March of this year found that 17% of LGBT+ people have experienced physical assault because of their gender or sexual identity, and the number for trans and non-binary people is almost 2 in 5. The Labour Party has a proud history of advancing LGBT+ rights, from legislating for a statutory right to NHS fertility treatment for lesbian and bisexual women, to leading a United Nations campaign for the decriminalisation of homosexuality, and of course to the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which is a groundbreaking change to the law at the time, but 21 years on, as the member for South Cotswold so eloquently put, is in need of reform and modernisation. Today, I believe the Labour Party once again has the opportunity to champion dignity and equality for all. Our manifesto commitments include a ban on all forms of conversion practices, improving access to high-quality NHS care, including gender-affirming care, making LGBT+ hate crime an aggravated offence, leading to harsher sentences, and that all-important gender recognition certificate reform. I know the profound impact it has when a law reflects your identity and allows you to live freely as who you are. Labour governments have always understood that, and we've always known that progress never comes from standing still or failing to show up when the going gets tough. The petition we're debating today calls for legal recognition based on self-identification. I completely understand why, as my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central and Headingley said, way back in 2015, our neighbours in Ireland introduced self-ID without incident or issue. In the words of an Irish woman I spoke to last week, the sky didn't fall in, and I'm pretty sure it's still up there. Meanwhile, trans people here still face long-winded, undignified, medicalised processes just to have their identity legally recognised. The Gender Recognition Act ultimately allows people whose gender identity doesn't correspond with the sex registered on their birth certificate to obtain recognition and a revised birth certificate. But as has been said, that process involves 2 medical certificates, including a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and details of any treatment received, and further to that, evidence of living in your true gender for at least 2 years and a declaration that you will continue to do so permanently. Clearly, there is much unfinished work ahead on untangling the legal mess we've been plunged into, on restoring dignity for transgender people, on modernising the Gender Recognition Act, and on ensuring our laws reflect the lives and identities of everybody in Britain. As a cis man, I understand completely that progress must be built on trust, on a consensus which I hope that we were able to come to, and on delivering what we've promised. But let's begin by delivering on banning conversion practices in all their vile forms, equalising punishment of all forms of hate crime, reviewing adult gender identity services and ensuring that all trans people receive appropriate and high quality care, and of course, making the Gender Recognition Act fit for the future. I'd like to invite the Minister to confirm that the Government is still fully committed to these advancements, as I am. Mr Mundell, I conclude by reaffirming my allyship for trans people who now, more than ever, need our respect, acceptance and steadfast support. Thank you.
I now call Charlotte Kane.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I also thank the petitioners for bringing this petition and the member for South Cotswolds for moving the motion. Since the Supreme Court decision, I've received a lot of emails from people in great distress and even fear. But I've also talked to women who I know have transitioned, women who were very, very confident, playing a strong role in their local community, in many cases standing to be councillors and things like that. And those confident women who I've known for years are now also very, very frightened and worrying about how they're going to manage under the current rules, guidelines, since the Supreme Court made its decision. We all know the NHS is in crisis, and this is true of the services for transgender people. As we've heard, they can correct their gender on their passport and their driving licence with just the support of their GP, but they can't get that all-important gender recognition certificate, and nor can they get the medical treatment they need, the hormones and so forth. We've heard they often have to wait up to 7 years just to be seen, or pay significant funds to see someone privately. And having paid for that diagnosis, there's no guarantee that their GP will prescribe the medication, so they then also have to pay for the medication privately. In the words of one woman navigating this system, it's a system that lacks any dignity and has put me in real danger, as I had to begin to live as a woman long before I had any hope of starting hormones to make doing so safer and easier to fit into society. The trauma of living in the gender you identify with while not fully looking like that gender is huge, and you become a target for people who think they have the right to abuse and assault you just because you're different. And we're requiring people to do that for 7 years before they get any help. Then they've got a further 2 years to live like that before they can get their certificate. We simply have to improve this situation. But the recent Supreme Court decision and the EHRC guidelines mean that even when people have their gender recognition certificate and have fully transitioned, sadly their problems are far from over. The Supreme Court has been misreported to have stated that a woman is someone who was born a woman. In fact, what they ruled was that for the purposes of part of the Equalities Act, the term woman means someone who was born as a woman. They went on to reaffirm that trans people's rights must be respected. But the EHRC almost immediately issued guidance that was unworkable and did not respect the rights of trans people. And we all understand that it's going to be contested legally. If a trans woman cannot use women's toilets and should instead use other toilets, what is she supposed to do? If she uses the gents, she risks abuse and assault. If she uses the disabled toilets, she takes up a facility which others might need. This is a major imposition on a person's life. When they want to travel, go to the theatre, go to a sports venue, they face the challenge, what are they going to do if they need the toilet? How can we be doing this to people? It's outrageous. One woman facing this dilemma told me, "Since the ruling, I have seen a flood of hate. I have lost friends to suicide, and I have friends struggling to survive. Public life brings social anxiety. For example, this Friday I'm travelling to Manchester. This is my first long trip away from home since the ruling, and it scares me. If I use female toilets, I could be apprehended. I'm sure I could not use the men's toilets, and disabled toilets also expose me if they're available. During my transition, I had several situations, including assault, and I thought that was all behind me. Going back to a life of fear in public is something I will struggle with and would do everything to avoid. Members, we can't allow this to continue. It's not acceptable. One of our core functions as MPs is to ensure people's safety, and we are not ensuring the safety of trans people. So I ask the Minister to talk to her colleagues in the Department of Health to ensure that people are seen promptly and supported through their transition. And I ask her to urge the Minister for Women and Equalities to work with women's groups and LGBTQ+ groups to provide guidance which is workable, which respects the rights of all vulnerable groups. And I further ask the Minister to work with colleagues to consider any necessary changes to the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. In 2016, the Scottish Government announced its intention to reform the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland and introduce self-ID. Years followed and the bill was introduced to the Scottish Parliament in 2022. Since then, according to statistics that started to be published in 2023, waiting times for gender identity clinic appointments are increasing. In June that year, 5,273 people were waiting for an appointment, with 45 people waiting longer than 5 years. At the 31st of March 2024, this had increased to 5,640, with 184 people waiting longer than 5 years. Transgender identity aggravated crime charges have doubled from approximately 40 in 2016-17 to over 18 in most years since 2021, which is unacceptable and must be acted upon and improved. This bill is not improving lives of transgender people. Mr. Chair, many people have faced abuse, intimidation and threats for expressing any concerns or opposition to self-identification. I know people whose careers have suffered, been cancelled or dismissed, and respected academics targeted. I've witnessed placards inciting violence and sexually aggressive language towards women, and currently we have the terrible situation of nurses being taken to employment tribunal for standing up for their rights provided in the Equality Act 2010. Mr. Chair, these threats and intimidation are almost always targeted at women. During the passage of the Gender Recognition Act, Scottish ministers repeatedly said that it was the most consulted on bill in the history of devolution. However, consultation is only meaningful if you listen to the feedback. One of the areas was ignored by the Scottish ministers was on prison placements. Self-ID was already being implemented in the prison estate across the UK. The issue was raised in the House in February 2019 after a woman was sexually assaulted in HMP Newhall. The then UK Government ordered a policy to review. The Scottish Government did nothing. This is just one example where the Scottish Government ignored warnings, leaving them to defend the indefensible. In the Supreme Court judgment on the case brought by For Women Scotland, Scottish ministers argued that for the purpose of sex under the Equality Act, a woman would be a biological woman, a person who had a gender recognition certificate identifying as a woman, or a person who self-identified as a woman. Had the Scottish ministers won, it would have meant that the rights of one protected characteristic would prevail over the rights of another. Again, a concern raised during the consultation that was not listened to and has been borne out in practice. One example being in March this year, some councillors who strongly support self-ID attempted to defund Edinburgh Women's Aid. The reason for doing so is that Edinburgh Women's Aid provided some services that did not include trans people. A women's project providing single-sex services, refuge and support for women, a lawful exemption provided for in the Equalities Act. Mr. Chair, happy to give away.
Thank you, Chair. Does she agree with me that threat to funding Edinburgh Women's Aid was an absolute disgrace, and we should be ashamed that that was even discussed in Edinburgh?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nat. I thank you for your intervention, and it brings me on to say that were those councillors really saying that trans people wanted to see vital supports withdrawn for women fleeing violence and abuse? These politicians do not represent the views of any trans person that I have met. Mr. Chair, self-identification has an impact on a number of protected characteristics across the Equality Act. Of course, we must do more to help and support trans people live healthy, happy and fulfilling lives, and we must bring respect and dignity to all. Trans men and women remain protected by the Equality Act that was proudly introduced by the last Labour government. Trans people must have appropriate services and protections from discrimination in the workplace, but this should never be at the expense of other protected groups. We all know that from the Sullivan Review that data is not being collected accurately and institutions continue to blur the lines between sex and gender. This is leading to gaps in provision for all people across communities. Replacing sex with gender identity erases biological difference, which is critically important for medical and health issues, criminal justice, education, sports and the rights of lesbian and gay men, to name but a few. Mr Chair, in conclusion, it is vital that we have an open communication with trans people to move this conversation forward. We all have a responsibility to remove the toxicity from this debate. This is not about winning or losing. It's about how we provide trans people with services, help them to live dignified lives, but with the understanding that sex is not an identity and gender and sex are not the same thing.
Thank you. I call Sian Berry.
Thank you, Mr Mandel. It is a pleasure to take part in this debate under your wing. And thank you from me too to John Bake for submitting the petition, and congratulations for securing enough signatures to win this debate today. I associate myself with the compassionate, thoughtful, rigorous, clear and helpful contributions from many honourable colleagues so far. I know the Minister is here listening today, and I hope that government more widely is listening hard to how these issues can be debated practically and with compassion and inclusion at its heart. I can see many colleagues here from constituencies whose citizens have signed this petition in large numbers. However, it will probably be of no surprise to other honourable members that my constituency of Brighton Pavilion has by far the largest number of signatories, almost twice that of any other when I last checked. In fact, every trans rights-related e-petition I can find on the Parliament website demonstrates just how trans-inclusive Brighton Pavilion's residents really are and how much they care to keep things that way. Trans inclusion runs through Brighton like its famous rock, and I'm immensely proud to represent such a famously compassionate city and constituency. And agreeing with this petition isn't just a Brighton thing. The policy of the Green Party voted on by our members is also to allow transgender people to self-declare their gender without barriers to secure their rights. It is also Green Party policy formally to recognise non-binary and intersex people on legal documents, something places like Iceland, Germany and Malta have already done as well. Now, as others have already reminded us, of course, the context for this debate is a highly worrying and uncertain time for trans people and their rights in the UK. Daily lives are now conducted in the shadow of the Supreme Court's ruling on sex and gender in the Equality Act. In what ways guidance for institutions and businesses will be changed permanently, and how the ruling's decision on one act affects the whole basis of the Gender Recognition Act is still under debate and legal challenge. My inbox, meanwhile, is full of words like shock, disbelief and fear from Brightonians worried about what the future may hold for themselves and the people they love. But, as always, my brilliant constituents are coming together in solidarity. And as their MP, I tabled an early day motion last week that was co-written with a trans woman in my constituency. Because so much of this debate happens without trans voices playing the part they need to. I'm really grateful to every member who's brought a trans voice into this room today. Our EDM is a simple call for solidarity and respect, recognising that transgender transition liberates trans people to be their true selves. And I believe every honourable member in this House can and should sign up to it. And ahead of this debate, Abigail, a constituent who also volunteered on the doorstep on my campaign last year, wrote to me telling me more about what this means to her. She says, I transitioned in April 2002. Before then, I drifted through life wanting to die, sometimes suicidal. Now I know who I am and what I want. Before, life was black and white, and it changed to full colour. Everyone has heard of gender dysphoria, the pain of pretending to be who one is not. trying to be masculine and feeling wholly inadequate. But on transition, we feel trans joy, the liberation of being who we really are. It is a gift to society. There are people being truly ourselves. Many people do not manage that. Before, I could not form relationships because I could not reveal who I am. Now I have close friends and a loving partner. I am a woman. I cannot explain that. It is simply true. Let's bear Abigail's words in mind and try to build back to more consensus on these issues. The fact that trans people are real, have rights, and a right to have their gender legally recognised in a fair process was something Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May acknowledged in 2017 and brought forwards for consultation. The fact is that the current process of obtaining a gender recognition certificate remains protracted, complex, and very unnecessarily intrusive. And the question being asked then was how to change the process to make it better, not whether to change it. The previous plans were officially dropped in 2020, I understand, by Liz Truss during Boris Johnson's government, and no Equalities Minister has yet officially gone back on that decision to relaunch a reform. But I hope this government will reconsider, and that is the question I want to ask the Minister today. Even though the benefits of having your true gender legally recognised are now in question, we can continue those arguments. Reforming this process is still sorely needed. So I say to them, please support my constituents, this petition and trans people across the country today and get this reform moving again.
I call Tim Roker.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I rise today in support of the petition and more broadly in support of the rights and dignity of transgender people in the UK. Because let's be clear, we're not just debating a petition, we're debating people's lives, as people have made clear. Now, in Macclesfield, we have a fantastic LGBTQ plus community that's shown solidarity with each other, including very recently with the Stride for Pride that's been run by the owners of Yazbeen. And solidarity is incredibly important. The history of the LGBTQ plus community hangs on a history of solidarity with each other. And the need for it is never been more clear than recently. The number of recorded transphobic hate crimes has surged in recent years. According to Home Office data, such crimes have more than doubled since 2016. That's not a culture war, that's real harm. That's fear, isolation and violence being felt by people simply trying to live as themselves. And while that's happening, our international standing in LGBTQ plus rights is falling. This year, the UK dropped, as members have noted, even further down the ILGA Europe rainbow map, which ranks countries by their equality laws. In 2015, we were first. What an incredible thing to be proud of. Last year, we dropped to 16th, and now, as of a few days ago, we're 22nd. We fall behind countries we once led, and it's not because we've gone backwards by accident. I fear it's because our political will has begun to fade. I'm happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and for setting out the point that we are actually falling behind many of our allies around the world. Does he share my concern that actually for the first time the UK is now rated amber rather than green, the only country in Western Europe to be rated this way, and that actually it was Labour governments that took forward LGBT rights in the past, and this Labour government ought to do the same.
Thank you, Chair. And I thank my honourable friend. He makes the point really, really well about why we should be extremely worried about what's happening to our record on LGBT rights. And I'll just say that his constituents in him have an excellent champion for their local LGBTQ plus community. Happy to give way.
Under the previous Trump administration, a travel warning was issued by the British Foreign Office to trans people because of the so-called bathroom ban, well, the actual bathroom ban in parts of the United States. And yet we're in a position now where many trans women and trans men are very frightened about using toilets. Does he not agree that this action is needed by the government on this?
I do, Chair. I completely agree with the Honourable Lady. She makes a very good point about how urgent action is needed. And one of the things that we've touched on significantly, almost all members today, is the recent UK Supreme Court ruling, which has created so much of the uncertainty about the legal rights of trans people, particularly trans women, under the Equality Act. And let me be clear, I'm not questioning the existence or the legitimacy of single-sex spaces. The Equality Act rightly allowed for such spaces in reasonable circumstances, particularly where privacy, dignity or safeguarding required it. But it was a balanced principle, and what the Supreme Court judgment did, in my view, was reinterpret that balance in a way that completely undermines the legal clarity that we had before and raises new concerns about consistency in application. That interpretation appears to directly contradict the spirit and the purpose of the Gender Recognition Act, which was passed to give trans people full legal recognition in their acquired gender. And the judgment not only strips away legal certainty for trans individuals, but risks making the GRC, as members have pointed out, a symbolic document with very little practical effect. And so it brings us to a critical question. What is the point? I feel like a member's about to intervene.
Thank you very much, and I thank my honourable friend. I was going to let him make that critical point there before intervening. I think it's fair to say that nobody is comfortable with the heated way in which debate has taken place over the past few years. But would he agree with me that, in actual fact, women's sex-based rights have been ignored for many years and not enforced, and that's what's led us to the place where we are today? And there has to be space for respectful discussion in order to find a way to improve the rights of trans people, whilst also respecting the hard-earned won rights of women.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. Where I agree with her completely is this debate, as has been pointed out already, has become incredibly toxic. We are seeing, with Reform and others, an attempt to import American-style politics to our country. And what we do need is a rational, reasonable debate that safeguards the dignity of all people. And I'm glad that she's made that point. And so that critical question that I was coming to was, what is the purpose of a GRC now? For many years we were told that the GRC was the legal mechanism by which a person's acquired gender would be recognised in law. But many people are now left wondering whether a GRC still confers the rights and recognition it was meant to. If a trans woman with a GRC can still be excluded from single-sex spaces and services, what legal certainty does that document offer? And why are we asking people to go through a lengthy, intrusive and often dehumanising process to obtain one? Happy to give way.
The honourable gentleman is making an important point, because the gender recognition certificate itself is often destroyed by trans people because they've got their new birth certificate. So actually, the certificate itself isn't always an extant document.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and as other colleagues have pointed out, the sky didn't fall in when these reforms, which have been passed in so many other countries across the world, have taken effect. We've heard from honourable members today, Chair, about the EHRC's first proposed guidance following the ruling, and it allowed just 2 weeks for consultation, 2 weeks to respond to complex legal changes that affect fundamental rights of our constituents, and it's simply not good enough. It risks shutting down people out of a conversation about their own lives and their own protections, and whilst I welcome that the period has now been extended, it should never have been that short in the first place. What trans people are asking for is clarity, dignity and fairness. They deserve to know where they stand under the law. They deserve to walk down the street without fear. They deserve representation in this place that doesn't question their right to exist. Happy to.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Now, parents of trans people have contacted me not only about their own fear, but also about the fear of their children in light of the Supreme Court judgment. Does he share my concern that it's not clear what they should tell their precious children, and that this is a totally unacceptable state of affairs? Does he agree that we should ask our fellow citizens to ask themselves, what would I advise if my own child were trans? And even, how would I like to be treated if I were trans? And if we can't answer that question, then clearly the situation we find ourselves in is completely unacceptable.
Thank you, Chair. And he makes the point extremely well. It's so depressing to hear of that fear that many of our constituents have expressed to us up and down the country, the chilling effect that this judgment has had. And I'll just say quickly, Chair, that I believe in rugby his constituents have a wonderful champion in him as a supporter of the LGBTQ+ community. So, Chair, to conclude, we can't keep deferring justice, we can't keep letting misinformation fill the gaps where leadership should be, and we can't let this debate be led by the most toxic voices. It's time for Parliament to lead with compassion and evidence, not confusion and delay, because trans rights are human rights and this country is better than the fear we're seeing take hold. Thank you, Chair.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mundell. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. It really is shocking that over 16,000 people are currently waiting for treatment at the London Gender Identity Clinic alone. And they are currently treating people referred in the summer of 2019. 6,225 children are currently waiting on gender waiting lists with waits of more than 3 years, completely normal. And if it takes that long to achieve a first appointment, imagine how long it takes to achieve 2 medical assessments. NHS figures issued last week have completely confused me, because according to NHS England, the referral to treatment figures for the whole country state there are only 147 people waiting more than 104 weeks, that's 2 years, for any treatment. How is that possible? Or are gender identity clinics not included within that? This doesn't make any sense at all. I'd be really interested to know how we can come up with figures and how we can look trans people in the face and tell them only 147 people are waiting for treatment when we know there are thousands and thousands waiting for life-affirming treatment for themselves. 50% of trans and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide in the last year alone, driven by stigma, exclusion and hate. And a local teacher from Dorset told me that he found it deeply upsetting to see young people feeling their rights stripped away, saying that the ruling is not just a setback for human rights but an act of erasure. Another trans constituent told me that a system that protects all women, including trans women, that we need a system that protects all women, including trans women, and went on to say that I'm asking you to see me and help build a future where trans people don't have to fight every day to exist. What a sad state of affairs. Of course I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to Honourable Friend for giving way. Would she agree with me that we need to do more to protect trans people in Somerset, for example, where trans hate crimes have increased from 119 to 179, and whilst providing women only spaces where they're needed, we need to do more to stand up for trans people who feel frightened and afraid and are being attacked.
You're absolutely right. The Honourable Member for Taunton is absolutely correct. And we have to also think about, we talk a lot about the needs of trans women. We talk very little about the needs of trans men. And I'm deeply concerned about the impact on trans men who may be forced to go into women's toilets. Many of them do an amazing job of masking and appearing to be men. I'm sure most of us know people but have no idea they are trans men, because so many of them are able to have fantastic facial hair, more so than some men that I know, incredible muscles and tattoos, and you'd have no idea. And imagine being a trans man and then being told you have to go to a women's refuge. Imagine being the women in that refuge and a trans man comes in and being told, well, I have to be here because I'm still going to be treated as a woman. That just is offensive. Of course I will.
In terms of the European Commission on Human Rights and the right to privacy, if a trans person has to out themselves every time they go to the toilet, does she, like me, believe that that fundamentally conflicts with that right to privacy?
I thank the Honourable Member for Aberdeen North for that intervention. I am shocked daily by the indignity that we are imposing and the impact on the human rights of people who are trans. Some words that have been used about the current gender recognition system: traumatic, intrusive and over-medicated. Just some words used by trans people about the current system. And I'm really pleased that one of our members in the other place, one of the Liberal Democrat members in the other place, is looking at how we remove the need for a spouse to consent. How can that be compliant with the human rights of a trans person that their spouse has to consent to them getting a gender recognition certificate. The recent Supreme Court ruling has made life as a trans person so difficult and calls into question the value of a gender recognition certificate. If these trans people who have undertaken all that is required to achieve that status are still to be treated as if they remain in the sex that they were assigned at their birth, what is the point of a gender recognition certificate? Therefore, self-ID seems the only viable alternative. So I ask the Minister direct, if self-ID is not to be progressed, what assurance can we have for our trans constituents that a gender recognition certificate will become easier and quicker to achieve? And that where a trans person has gone through many years of distress, treatment, cost and trauma, they deserve to be honoured and respected, recognising them as their legally acquired gender. I recently recruited a member of staff. Unfortunately, they didn't stay with me very long because they found the whole process quite traumatic. And the day before they were due to start, they emailed me to tell me that they were trans and they thought I needed to know. I was so upset that they felt the need to do that. What sort of world are we in that someone has to share that sense of that private information with me as their employer and then were so traumatised by it, decided that they couldn't work in this role after all? I felt absolutely sickened. The Good Law Project recently said that given the hostile direction of travel in the UK, we, the Good Law Project, do not think it is a decent risk to be on a state list of trans people. I just want to go back to something that the Honourable Member for Aberdeen North said about death. I cannot imagine anything more awful for a parent to lose a child, as we've seen in recent years, particularly if it's been a violent death or a death by suicide, or somebody who has lived their life for many, many years in their acquired gender, and then to not be able to lay the person they love to rest in the gender in which they lived. There is no greater indignity than that. And if we do nothing else, I beg the Minister, make that change, that people do not need a gender recognition certificate for their death certificate. That is absolutely inhumane.
I call for Enda Hughes.
Del, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I welcome the opportunity to be able to contribute to this afternoon's debate. I wish to begin by expressing my full support for the trans community and their right to live openly and authentically. Every individual in our country must be allowed the freedom to live their truth, free from discrimination and fear, and to be treated with dignity and the respect that they deserve. I'm especially proud that the City of Wolverhampton Council, based in my constituency of Wolverhampton West, made history back in 2016 by electing the first transgender councillor to office. That moment was not only a milestone for our city, but also a powerful symbol of what can be achieved when inclusion and equality are not just discussed, but put into practice. And I'm sure that Wolverhampton, my city, will continue to lead the way in promoting acceptance and equal rights for all. I mentioned the UK Supreme Court's judgment earlier in an intervention in the case of For Women Scotland and the Scottish ministers. And as a member of the Justice Select Committee, I have had the opportunity to inquire into that decision further. That decision confirmed that sex, for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010, referred to biological sex, and that trans women, even with a gender recognition certificate, are not considered to be women under the Equality Act's provisions on sex-based protections and rights. But that the ruling does not strip trans people of their right to be protected from discrimination, harassment, victimisation and unfair treatment. However, the decision has created a legal distinction between biological sex and legal gender, and that has obviously created a lot of confusion and uncertainty in areas such as access to single-sex spaces. So the government must act to find a way to uphold the rights of women and trans people without pitting them against each other, which is what has happened in the past. It is crucial that the government recognises that transitioning is not a choice and that the transitioning process often comes with a deep and often difficult journey of self-understanding and acceptance, with the associated stress and emotional strain of coming to terms with one's new gender identity. Mr. Mundell, the law is not static, and never it should be, because it evolves with society, and society itself evolves through empathy and understanding of others. I'm pleased that this government has committed to a wider range of support for the trans community, including trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices and a review of adult gender identity services. However, we do have a duty to ensure through further legislation that trans people are given proper legal recognition for their gender, and that we demonstrate respect and compassion towards all our communities. This is not about special treatment, it is about equal treatment, and sending a message to everyone in our country that they have the right to live freely and proudly as who they are and not as we think they are. Consequently, we need to reassure transgender people within our communities that they have the right and ability to live as their authentic self, free from fear and discrimination.
I call Pippa Halings.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I also want to thank my honourable friend from South Cotswolds for moving this motion and with such a powerful speech as well, as much as I'd like to thank all of the signatories to this petition. I want to add my voice to the calls for transgender people to be able to change their legal gender through self-identification, and in particular without the needs and recourse for a medical diagnosis for gender dysphoria. And this petition reflects a long-standing call for dignity, simplicity and fairness in how we treat some of the most marginalised people in our society. We seem to be going backwards rather than forwards, because the Women and Equalities Committee spent years scrutinising the Gender Recognition Act. As early as 2016 and again in its 2022 report, the committee recommended a move to a more streamlined, demedicalised process, recognising that being trans should never be treated as an illness. And yet that is exactly what the current process continues to do. The requirement to obtain a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria from an NHS gender clinic doctor is not only seen to be dehumanising and daunting for those involved, but these days almost practically impossible, inaccessible. And as other MPs have done, I would like to bring into this debate the voice of trans people as well, and in particular from my constituency of South Cambridgeshire. Let me share the very human story of what it is like in practice to play this story out. The story of a trans woman who embodies the struggle that this petition seeks to address. Jennifer is a trans woman, a close friend and a colleague of mine. And she happily changed her gender in her passport and driving licence back in 2023 after a visit to her GP. Self-declaration in practice. And I remember the joy of that day, her joy and pride in what she said was her most life-affirming moment. But that was short-lived, because she then realised that this didn't entitle her to the next steps towards a gender recognition certificate, nor to her hormone treatment. For that, she needs a diagnosis of gender dysphoria from an NHS gender clinic. With the NHS in crisis and the reality in provision now, she is now 2 years into what is likely to be a 6-year wait at least. A cruel and unnecessary delay for a basic recognition of her identity. She has been able to form the most special of relationships, but she's not able to marry her partner in her own acquired gender without that gender recognition certificate. And more dangerously, she's had to turn to private treatment at huge personal costs. Her GP still refuses to prescribe the hormones she needs, citing loopholes that discredit private diagnoses. We've heard today about the mental health impacts of this process,
And the stress and uncertainty this causes, they're not hypothetical. The situation in which Jennifer finds herself is dangerous. She has told me that to procure that medication informally is literally just to survive, because the alternative of not being able to live in her acquired gender and to change and transition, as she puts it, would be practically suicide-inducing. So she lives in limbo, denied the basic dignity of legal recognition. And there are huge questions over the need for this medical diagnosis. As the Equalities Committee concluded, this diagnosis is outdated. The World Health Organization has moved from gender dysphoria to gender incongruence under a non-mental health classification. The UK is now out of step with international best practice. Ireland, Denmark, New Zealand and Argentina have all reported positive administrative and public health outcomes from these policies based on legal gender self-declaration. And as we've heard today, these nations are not collapsing. The sky has not fallen in. They are modernising. And yet here in the UK, we continue to ask trans people to navigate a legal process that is, by the government's own consultation, dehumanising, overly bureaucratic and prohibitively expensive. We continue to ask trans people to prove that they are ill in order to access the legal right to live as their authentic selves. This contradiction is not only outdated, it is harmful. Trans people like Jennifer are not asking for special treatment. They're asking for respect, safety and recognition. And I would like Jennifer to know that she is heard. We see you, we value you, we respect you. And that is why I am asking the government, urging them to ask, asking the Minister to reconsider the recommendations of the Women and Equalities Committee that said, allow self-identification, remove the requirement for a gender dysphoria diagnosis from the Gender Recognition Act, and in fact reform the Gender Recognition Act completely to enable self-identification as this petition requests. Thank you.
And I now call Olivia Blake.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Mundell, and I thank the honourable member for the South Cotswolds for opening the debate. I think they did that incredibly well on a topic that does often get heated, but I think today we've shown that we can discuss these issues without that. And I would like to thank the over 100,000, 20,000 people who signed it, and especially the 250 people who signed it from my constituency. I am going to touch on ILGA Europe's recent report, which sees the fall from the UK from 22nd place in the rainbow map of Europe. And that should really concern us all. It is not just a warning about LGBT rights, but a signal of a broader erosion of democratic protections across Europe. At the heart of the decline is a failure to uphold the dignity and autonomy of trans people, particularly when it comes to something as fundamental as a legal gender recognition. And I'm exceedingly embarrassed about this. To fall so far when just 10 years ago we were #1 is just unforgivable, and we all need to look very hard at ourselves in the mirror for allowing that to happen. In recent debates, we've heard government ministers affirm that LGBT rights in the UK remain protected and that we are firmly committed to equality. I welcome this, as it is something we all want to see upheld both in spirit and practice. But right now, I've heard from countless people the fear from so many of my constituents, trans parents, parents of trans children, and some have actually spoken to me about leaving the UK. How embarrassing. How embarrassing that we've fallen so far that people would rather not live here because they feel their lives are so unlivable in the society that we are creating. Yeah, I'm happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Naively at university in the 80s, I believed in the early 90s that I would generally see the end of sexism and racism. Does my honourable friend agree that we've fallen so far backwards over the last 14 or 15 years, entirely down to a party obsessed with staying in power rather than doing the best for its citizens?
Yeah, and I mean, I would be in here talking about migrants and other communities who have been victimised and kind of used as a scapegoats repeatedly over the last 15 years, which it's been sad to see. And, you know, we are seeing that across the globe, unfortunately, and it's something that we should all be standing up against. And we should be dealing with people's actual daily concerns. And I feel that far too often we use rhetoric rather than dealing with those. And as we've heard from colleagues today, trans people will not feel protected right now. They're navigating rising levels of hate, extending levels and delays to healthcare, increasing uncertainty about how existing laws apply to their lives, and they are being told that their identity, their very sense of self, is something that we can debate, that we can question, and we can deny. I think that is wrong. And I urge all people out there who are looking at the advice that's been given as interim guidance not to make knee-jerk reactions to that and to fully take part in the consultation, and that consultation should be 12 weeks long, as previous consultations have been, for something that's going to have such a big change on individuals. I think the EHRC have got that wrong and need to extend it even further than they have. And I also just think it's quite sad that, you know, we need to see, and I think it's right that we see a way for people to self-identify their legal gender. And it matters for many reasons. And I think a lot of politicians, sadly, and wrongly, think that, isn't it sad, or isn't it a shame that trans people are trans people? How completely wrong is that? And I think that for too many people, they live in fear with false statistics about the risk that people have to women. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. My honourable friend, just on that point, would you agree with me that trans women and trans men should have services and provision on that basis, and that sex and gender are two very separate things?
I think it's very problematic if we go down that track for all services. I think that the equality right and how it was interpreted previously is correct, that people should be excluded where there is a necessary need for that, and it should be on the basis of on balance, you know, and I think that's true for all protected characteristics actually, and when they come into conflict. But I also, I'm going to make some progress if you don't mind, because I've only got a little bit of time. But I think, you know, that idea that it's a shame or it's somehow sad that people are trans is completely and utterly wrong. As has been said, trans joy exists. The many trans people I know, the many non-binary people I know, live joyful lives, and we should celebrate those lives rather than suggesting that it's still a mental health condition, even though WHO have said it's not. Rather than making a protracted medicalised kind of route to just get a piece of paper that says your correct gender, I think is really problematic and something that we should continue to question. And this is why the right to self-identify one's legal gender really, really matters. It's about basic freedoms to live as oneself. That means being able to go to your local supermarket, your local cafe, and not be fearful of being challenged when you're going to the bathroom. It's about, without intrusive medical gatekeeping, which takes years and years and years for you to just get to that point. And I think that, you know, we know we're out of step internationally here. We know that the health advice has moved on, just as hysteria moved on from when women got categorised as that. You know, there's many, many groups of people who've been wrongly categorised as mentally in the past just for being themselves, and I think we need to get away from that gatekeeping. Outdated bureaucracy or humiliation, as we heard again and again and again in consultations about the process as it stands. The EHRC's recent guidance on sex and gender in single-sex services has created further concern among my constituents, as well as charities, schools and employers who want to act properly but now feel unclear about their responsibilities. We need clarity that it reinforces inclusion, not ambiguity that creates fear. And I'm pleased that Labour committed to make the GRC process simpler in our manifesto, but the recent judgment is very concerning and it risks undermining the existence of these certificates in themselves if we're not careful and if the guidance goes the wrong way. Trans healthcare too is an area where we need action urgently, and current NHS waiting times and the indefinite ban on puberty blockers are leaving people in limbo for years. This not just a policy challenge, it's a public health issue, and one that requires compassion, evidence, leadership, and I hope that the puberty blockers trial is as wide as possible and as scientific as can be. And I thank Mr Mundell for allowing me to speak for this long, but the rights are not a zero-sum game. We cannot protect one group without protecting another, and we need to strengthen the whole. I urge ministers to continue listening to trans people, to ground decisions in evidence, and to act with the courage that true equality demands, and make sure that instead of us just standing up here, that we have proper consultation which has the voice of trans, non-binary, intersex, and all represented in the evidence that it hears, and that is taken on board, so that we don't have a situation where we are trying to police people going into toilets, which could be really problematic to those who do not fit or conform to gender stereotypes, as we've heard in this debate. But it's not just about toilets. This is about dignity in death, as we've heard, dignity to privacy, and to make sure that you have the ability to have that joyful life that we all want everyone to have.
And I call Martin Rhodes, and I can assure Dr Arthur that when I leave the chair, he'll be called.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairing. I thank the honourable member for South Cotswolds for her introduction to this petition before us today. My constituency of Glasgow North has the second highest number of signatories to this petition after Brighton Pavilion. This has also been reflected in my inbox. I thank those constituents for making their views known through signing the petition and through correspondence, and those with a range of different views on the issue for contacting me. This petition refers to people's self-identity. Let us be clear, all of us have our own identity. How we see ourselves is an integral part of the human condition and is universal. It is something that is part of how we understand ourselves, how we seek to relate to others, how we feel about who we are. We all have our own journey to self-identity and hopefully to acceptance of that identity. Legislation cannot stop that innate self-identification of human nature, but legislation can frame how easily we can live that identity honestly, openly, and safely. This is as relevant for trans men and trans women as it is for any human being. Supporting trans people to have their self-identity respected is as important as it is for all of us. This is not a claim for special treatment. It is a call for equality in how people are treated. I believe we need to modernise, simplify and reform the Gender Recognition Act. This particularly means reviewing adult identity services to ensure that all trans people can access appropriate, timely and high-quality care. Trans people are so often let down by health care and support services. That said, I recognise that easier access to gender recognition certificates is only meaningful if it enables trans women and trans men to live with dignity and respect. This brings me to the recent Supreme Court case. It is extremely important to highlight that the court warned against reading the judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. Transgender people are protected by the Equality Act through the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Although the ruling clarifies the legal definition of sex in the Act, it does not clarify how the Act should be implemented or how the Gender Recognition Act interacts with the Equality Act and the right to privacy. There needs to be an inclusive process of working through the Equality Act and its range of protected characteristics. The Supreme Court judgment provides clarity on the legal definition of one of those protected characteristics, but does not in any way negate the importance of the other protected characteristics, including gender reassignment. It is clear there are complexities in how these protections interrelate, and careful thought must be given to guidance on this. The Equality and Human Rights Commission is due to provide an updated code of practice, and I believe their deliberations must be informed by the voices and lived experience of those affected. and I've written to that effect to the Commission. The interim guidance they published so far has only highlighted the complexity and the urgent need for appropriate and inclusive consultation and engagement. That process is necessary to avoid institutions and businesses acting in ways that fail to fully take into account the full range of responsibilities in relation to all protected characteristics. Action without a full recognition of responsibilities risks causing harm not only to trans people, but also to non-binary individuals and those whose gender expression does not conform to stereotypical expectations of their sex. There is a danger the law could be implemented in such a way that it forces trans individuals into distressing and unsafe scenarios, simply for existing in public spaces, while at the same time putting public and private organisations potentially in breach of their legal responsibilities and of not protecting effectively those that they seek to protect. This is why broad, inclusive consultation is vital. There is a need for actions which are proportionate, risk-based, trauma-informed, inclusive, and have appropriate safeguards and protections for all. The Supreme Court judgment that sex in the Equality Act means biological sex creates an impossible dilemma for many trans people in everyday situations. Trans man could be legally required to use a woman's changing room because he was assigned female at birth. But because he presents as male, he may be challenged or even excluded by staff or other users who assume he's in the wrong place. At the same time, if he tries to use the men's changing rooms, the one that matches his gender identity and appearance, he risks being accused of unlawfully accessing a single-sex service not intended for him. This situation essentially leaves him and other users of these facilities without a dignified option. I have long campaigned for LGBT+ rights and will continue to do so. We must never lose sight of the fact that real people's lives are at the heart of this issue. Equality depends on us upholding our shared values, such as open-mindedness, and it requires continued advocacy for groups and individuals too often marginalised in our society. Trans people have the right to live with dignity, safety, and equality under the law. These are worrying times for many, and I share many of those anxieties. I regret the nature of too many discussions around these issues. But I remain hopeful that by listening calmly to each other, there is a way forward rooted in the shared values of inclusivity, respect, and equality. With these values and the actions that need to lead from them, we can all benefit. The denial of the right of one community, one person, to be openly and genuine themselves diminishes us all. It is our challenge as legislators to address these issues, and I commend the petitioners for taking this opportunity to remind us here in this place of that responsibility. To them, I say thanks.
Dr. Scott Arthur.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under you today, Ms Furness. And isn't it fitting that we've had a change of gender in the seat during this debate? It's quite incredible. And I thank the member for South Cotswolds for opening this debate. And I do want to quote two of the speakers in this debate just right at the start. I think the member for Wolverhampton West summed up so much when he's not in his place just now, when he said being trans isn't a choice. And also the member from South Cotswolds when she said everybody has a right to be themselves. And I think that's an incredibly important point which applies to everyone. And in my maiden speech, I did make the point that it would be there for everyone in my constituency, because I do know in the last Parliament, on this issue, many people right across the UK didn't feel they could approach their MP to discuss this issue. And I think that's something that should shame us all. So I consider myself to be an ally of the LGBT community, not least because I'm the proud father of a gay woman. And I do look forward, and I do hope we'll hear today from the Minister about the implementation of our manifesto in this area. In so many doorsteps in Edinburgh South West, this time last year, I was pointing to that section of the manifesto and saying this is our commitment. So hopefully we'll see it sooner rather than later. And I do want to talk about two of the people I spoke to on the doorstep last year. The first was a mother of a trans woman, and I think without doubt she was this person who I spoke to the longest on the doorstep, and it was incredibly moving. She was talking about how as her daughter moved through puberty, how she really struggled to come to terms with herself and the problem that caused her. And her daughter believed that if she didn't eat, it would delay the onset of puberty. And that led to her almost dying. Quite an incredible situation. And so that told me that back then that perhaps there is a case for puberty blockers in an absolute minority of cases where it could save a life. I think it's really important. And I think, you know, that girl is now a woman, and the last I heard, she's leading a full life, thanks to quite an incredible mother. And then a few weeks after that, I spoke to the mother and father of 2 teenage girls. And they were concerned about this debate because they were concerned that their daughters would go into a toilet and be confronted by a trans woman, or worse still, as they seen it, someone masquerading as a trans woman. And it's tempting to view these two sets of parents as opposing each other. But in fact, they had so much in common because both of them loved their children and really just wanted the best for them. And quite naively, I dreamt that perhaps the solution was to get these parents together so they could see this issue from different perspectives and perhaps find common ground. But people, Scottish MPs here will know that that was incredibly difficult in Scotland because the nature of this debate in Scotland became incredibly toxic. I don't know how bad it was in England, but it could not have been worse than it was in Scotland. And the great shame, and the thing we should be ashamed of, is it became difficult to talk about this issue in social circles because you didn't know what perspectives people had and how strongly their feelings would be. And that doesn't support the rights of minority groups when we can't even talk about their rights in that setting. And so I do want to quote another contribution today, and that's from my colleague, the member for Bathgate and Linlithgow, and she says what we need is a respectful debate, and that's right. I think what's good is the EHRC's consultation around the Supreme Court's ruling has been extended to 6 weeks, and I really do hope that is open and inclusive, and as well as people telling or suggesting to EHRC how they think the world should be, I hope we find space to listen to each other, because I think that's what we've been missing this debate for the last 5 years ago. Thank you, Ms Furness.
Spokesperson Christine Jardine, please.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, Ms Furness. And I'd like to congratulate the honourable member for South Cotswolds for leading this debate with such a powerful speech on behalf of the 120,000 people who want us to consider this and consider it carefully. And I want to thank so many who have brought the voice of the trans community into this chamber today, because they need to be heard. But more than that, they need to be listened to. For the past 6-8 months, this debate, in fact, for the past 3.5 years, this debate has been a big part of my life. Not just because I am a Scottish MP and I recognise what the honourable member for Edinburgh South West was talking about, but because I have been at the centre of our formation of our policy in the Liberal Democrats on this specific issue. And the revised policy that we came up with sets out our continued commitment to self-ID. The proposals put forward by the Conservative government in 2018 to reform the gender recognition process, and which we first endorsed in 2014, are at the heart of it. Those proposals would remove the requirement to provide medical reports confirming a gender dysphoria diagnosis, as well as a spousal veto. A horrible requirement for the person applying for a GRC to provide a statutory declaration of consent from their spouse if they are to be married. Applicants would still have to prove that they have lived in their affirmed gender for at least 2 years and make a legal declaration that they intend to live permanently in that gender for the rest of their life. Put simply, self-ID. It would be clearer, simpler and less intrusive. But for me, that's just the paperwork. It's not really what this is about. Because I think more than anything else, that's what I learned over the past year, listening to various groups, hearing their views on what was needed to protect the trans community and the LGBTQ community in general in this country. It's about valuing people. It's about recognising their worth, their human rights, their right to live a life free of victimisation, discrimination, fear or anxiety. As the Honourable Member for South Cotswold said, this is not about an abstract debate, but about real lives, real people, which is where I begin to struggle with a lot of the things that have been said over the past 3 years, because this is about people who at the moment are living in distress, distress caused by the uncertainty created by the Supreme Court ruling and the EHRC interim guidance. For so many of them, it has meant that the lives that they have led, in some cases for decades, quite straightforwardly, quite simply, quite happily, recognised by their peers, has been thrown into doubt. And suddenly in this country, it seems that rather than making progress in protecting people's rights, we are regressing. We've had that toxic debate, 3 years of it in Scotland, much longer, I suppose, in some places. But we've had 3 years of pitting one vulnerable group against another. On the one hand, the rights of women, on the other, the rights of the trans community, which to me is utterly ridiculous. To pit two vulnerable groups against each other, who are both afraid and continually victims of discrimination and violence, completely losing sight of the damage that we are doing to both groups. I completely understand and sympathise with the arguments put forward by those who feared that women could be vulnerable to attack in certain circumstances and in single-sex spaces unless we protect them. Of course we should protect them, but that's not anything to do with the rights of the trans community. They are not the problem. And their rights should not be impacted by the rights of women. One person's rights should never be contingent on another's. And yet that's what we have done. And the statistics that we've heard are frightening, outlined by some honourable members, how we've made people targets, the trans community targets. And that saddens me to my core, that the debate around fundamental rights, the rights maybe of your friends, your family, your neighbours, your work colleagues, have been so toxic. Just recently, a friend of mine, whose child is trans, told me that since the ruling, she now worries that how are they expected to go about their life every day. Simple things we take for granted. Going to the toilet at work, for goodness sake. And funnily enough, not so long ago, she had told me how wonderful it was to see them, now that they had completed the transition, happy in themselves, living the life that they had always wanted to live. And that is why I believe that we need to think seriously about self-ID. We need to think seriously about how we put an end to the confusion and anxiety that is being felt by too many people in this country. Just think for a moment if we'd been talking about your child, your brother, sister, friend. Yes, there are questions that we have to overcome about prisons, about single-sex spaces. But those problems should not come before protecting the rights of anyone. Somehow, that has been lost in the toxic debate, but we have to stop. We have to change the narrative around this issue. It's clear today that people want us to find a way forward, to stop rehearsing bitter arguments and look for ways to help one another, to help people find a way forward, to allow everyone to be free to live the lives that they want to lead. I remember a time not unlike this one when another campaign of fear, the threat of HIV and AIDS, made life insufferable for the gay community in this country. That we would now live in a society which embraced same-sex relationships, allowed us all to be free to love who we love, was unimaginable then. But we've changed. My generation, my friends, went through hell then. Well, now another generation needs our help and our support in protecting their rights. And if we don't protect their rights, then we risk losing all our rights. Women's rights, children's rights, men's rights, minority rights, Trans rights are all human rights, and if we don't protect one, we risk losing them all. So I would ask the government to examine what they're doing at the moment. A friend of mine said to me today we should judge our society by how we treat our vulnerable minorities. I would ask the government to do that, to look at the legislation and look at how it's treating our vulnerable minorities and ask themselves if that is acceptable, or if they're prepared to put an end to the confusion, the anxiety and the fear. Yes, certainly.
Thank you. I appreciate you giving me on that point. When you talk about vulnerable categories, do you include women and lesbian and gay men in that as well?
I thank the honourable member, but I think I've made it absolutely clear that I include women in that, and I include all the LGBT community. But what I object to, with every fibre of my being, is those vulnerable groups being pitted against each other, and I think we all do. I think every group in this society, every vulnerable group, deserves the protection not just of its government, but of its community. And I would ask the government to think about that. Think about whether it's time to allow trans people in this country to have the same freedom. It's not a privilege, it's a right. The same freedom to live the lives that they want to live, as they would have in Ireland, Germany, Iceland, so many others. So many others, we're falling behind and letting our people down. Thank you.
Person Mims Davis.
Thank you, Ms Furness. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to speak on behalf of His Majesty's loyal opposition. And I'm grateful for the many thoughtful contributions from the members today. I'm also grateful to the Honourable Lady from South Cotswolds for opening the debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee, and I recognise the important reflection of the trans voices that she brought into the chamber, and it was compassionate and absolutely right to recognise strong feelings and concerns on all sides. As many of us have heard today, we have friends, constituents and colleagues affected by today's debate, and dignity, understanding and respect is absolutely crucial. And I am always mindful we are talking about people in this debate, or any debate, and listening to people, parents and communities is absolutely crucial in this. Now, last month's Supreme Court ruling importantly clarified the law as per the Equality Act. There are still many, as we've heard today, real practicalities that need to be agreed and therefore implemented. And several of my constituents, and if we heard today, many constituents have been in touch with their MPs and have written to say exactly this. What does this mean for them? Now, the judgment calls rightly for the rights of trans and non-binary people to be upheld as per the Equality Act. It is no surprise that perhaps this wider uncertainty has resulted in this petition, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss where the opposition sits on this matter and where the government must simply do more in the light of the concerns. I agree it's important to lead these discussions in the tone, in the right tone, and as I said, it's always my approach. However, also, as the Shadow Minister for Women, I believe we must ensure that we work for a future where women do not have to fight for their rights every time, and nobody has to keep fighting for all of their rights every time. And this reflects the comment made by the Honourable Lady from Edinburgh North and Leith, and also reflects the respectful comments by the Honourable Lady from Bathgate and Linlithgow. And I think that summed up this afternoon's tone and approach. Therefore, let me affirm for my party, we strongly believe that every individual should live a life of dignity and be free as to how to live their lives and be safe
to do so, and safety has been very much raised today, and rightly should be supported in that. And we are a party that is inclusive and focused on equality, and will always stand up for the rights of women and girls too, of course.
Thank you so much. I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. I'm just wondering how the Honourable Member can square the Amendment 21 to the Data and Access Bill that would expose trans people in everything that they do with the commitment of the Honourable Member to the safety of trans people. It is one thing that just does not seem to fit together.
I think, however, it is a matter of fact that biological sex is crucial. It is crucial when it comes to correct service delivery and approach. I understand the point the Honourable Lady makes, but I think when it comes to treatment and being understanding that, I think it's very important that there is a distinction here. But I do understand the point that she makes. If we consider single-sex spaces, such as refuges, and we've heard this today, also NHS provision and, as inferred, screening programmes, for instance, the protection and privacy, and there's a balance that the Honourable Lady has just made here, of people, also indeed of women and girls, is paramount. And that does need to be balanced by the needs of others. So third spaces or understanding is important. And as I said today, practicality is important. We have heard many members today say this is not a zero-sum game for anybody, whether it is women and girls and their safe spaces. And also, as we've heard today, suitable spaces for disabled people. This is about rounded equality for all, and I truly believe that is vital. Now, we know that the Labour government has not always agreed with necessarily the judgment of the recent case, and of course it was Scottish Labour that backed the SNP's self-ID plans in Holyrood, as discussed tonight, today rather, or is tonight, which were of course challenged in the Supreme Court and shown to be, as written, incompatible with the Equality Act. So some people still have, of course, very strong views. We've heard them again today around self-ID, and I do roundly recognise this. But for those concerned at the gender recognition certificate process, I do highlight that this was already reformed by listening rightly to feedback. The then government agreed with the GRC process as it created, hopefully, a balance between significant and checks and balances within the system. But as we've heard today, people take different stances. But if people have reflected in the Chamber today, it is now for the government in place now to find a way to clarify, in the light of this ongoing debate and the Supreme Court judgment, how it tends to implement its manifesto commitment in modernising and simplifying the GRC process without compromising the rights of women and girls. And these buzzwords do signify an intent of change. And as we have heard today, what people living this right now want to know is what the detail. And I understand the Minister opposite will hopefully today start to clarify or begin to set maybe a timetable for any of the proposals to be rightly scrutinised by the House and, of course, by the public and all the different voices in this debate. And it is crucial because there is public concern by some that the government may be introducing a self-ID by the back door. Not deliberately, but perhaps through processes that some may see as carelessness, as discussed today, and some people may see as suitable. Now, on one specific point, it is a concern, and it's been heard that frontbench ministers from the government have admitted that the Passport Office doesn't accurately record sex. Now, the passport is one of the most recognised and commonly used government-issued IDs with a sex marker. Can the Minister opposite help as to why the government has not seek to take action to remedy this situation, as it is clear that it does leave a potential route for self-ID, creating uncertainty, as we've heard today, for service providers who are trying to comply with the law under the Equality Act, but equally we're... Let me just finish this sentence. But today we're talking about clarity, and this is what clarity is needed for all concerned, of course.
The Shadow Minister is making the case that biological sex is incredibly important, she says, for things like medical procedures, absolutely. I'm not sure how she thinks that the marker on your passport has any relationship. If, as has been argued, biological sex is immutable and cannot be changed, then surely it doesn't matter what it says on your passport or on your driving licence or on your birth certificate even, because there is some magical way of ascertaining people's biological sex that nobody's yet told me, unless it's a DNA test. Why does the biological sex matter on a passport if it is, as she says, or as a number of people have said, immutable and can't be changed anyway?
Well, the previous government commissioned Professor Alice Sullivan to ensure that data collection was consistent across government when it came to sex and gender. And as I was saying earlier, it would be good to know how the government will set out a timeline in terms of implementing the Sullivan review in terms of the recommendations fully. Now, I understand the point she's making and other members opposite, but I think it's really important for people to understand in terms of data collection at this point. I'll let the Honourable Lady come in.
Thank you very much. I thank the Honourable Member for giving me, but I find it confusing and incomprehensible. Why does the government need that data? Why do we need that data? Is there not a danger that it also gets into the hands of the wrong people and there's a breach of privacy? But I just don't understand why we need it. Medical records, yes, but the government?
Well, perhaps she can put that to the government minister about the Sullivan review and we'll get some clarity on that. Additionally, the government should be issuing schools guidelines at pace to see consistency, and that's exactly what we've just been talking about, and understanding across the education landscape. Now, teachers and head teachers need to have the confidence that they will not be open to challenge, and that self-ID does not operate in the school system, and that parents are involved at every stage of their youngsters' education. So I do look forward to the response to the Minister on the matters raised, not just by me, but members across the Chamber and, of course, in the petition. And it's important that we ensure that women and girls have an experience in life that is safe and fair, that there is equality for all, that we get the practical understanding that trans people need delivered upon urgently, as this petition and many of the questions in the Chamber has been raised. As we've heard today, this should not be a zero-sum game, that there should be no failings in duties, that people should be able to deliver on this judgment, but it should be ultimately reassuring for all to be able to thrive in their lives respectfully, positively, with good guidance and good support. Thank you.
Government Minister.
Thank you, Ms Furness. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship and to respond to this debate today, which has been held with tremendous respect for the issues and also for each other and for trans people and for the issues that we face in navigating through, particularly after the Supreme Court ruling. And I want to thank the Honourable Member for South Cotswolds for the way in which she opened the debate and the extremely powerful speech that was made, and the importance indeed of bringing the voices of the trans community into these debates. And I also will also want to mention that I'm speaking on behalf of the Honourable Member for
Llanelli, who is unable to be in the House due to making a visit abroad. And I will be discussing with her the debate and the issues that have been raised today, and I'm sure that on some of these matters she will also update the House in due course. But I also want to join in thanking all of those who have signed the petition, and indeed all honourable members who have taken part in the debate today. I am proud to be a member of the party which introduced the Equality Act in 2010, and it's a piece of legislation I know that has been referred to by many colleagues in the debate, and it is indeed a world-leading piece of legislation that reflected our commitment to ensuring that every member of our society was treated with dignity and respect and afforded the same basic rights as each other. Our commitment to those principles remains resolute, and I am sure that all participating in the debate today can agree that these are at the very heart of what we want our society to represent. I want to repeat one phrase that for me really stood out in this debate, which is that everyone has a right to be themselves. And it is important that we keep in our minds those who are feeling very insecure, as has been talked about today. And whilst I may not be able to cover all of the points, I will be doing my best to do so. And I also want to assure that the comments are on record and have been heard by the government. Now, as the Honourable Member for Cannock Chase also mentioned, the government has a very strong history of promoting LGBT plus rights, from the decriminalisation of homosexuality under Harold Wilson's government in 1967, through the repeal of Section 28 and onto the introduction of civil partnerships in the early 2000s. We have consistently led the way in advocating for legal equality and social progress for LGBT plus people. It was our then Labour government that equalised the age of consent, extended adoption rights to same-sex couples, and introduced legislation aimed at combating discrimination and hate crime in the workplace. We laid the crucial groundwork for marriage equality and elevated LGBT plus issues to the forefront of public and political discourse, a legacy that I know that Parliament, as well as our colleagues on this House, will take great pride in. The conversation surrounding rights, particularly those related to trans individuals, has sadly become increasingly divided and divisive, as this debate has so importantly highlighted. And we, I think, all agree that it is necessary to approach this debate with honesty, with respect, and with sensitivity to all viewpoints. It is in a similar vein that Lord Hodge, when delivering the Supreme Court judgment that sex means biological sex for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010, underscored the importance of not viewing the judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. That has been referred to a number of times in the debate today. And the entrenchment of division and that ever greater polarisation seeks only to move us away from holding the empathetic, meaningful and productive conversations that holistically address the issues that stem from this debate. That is why we have emphasised the importance of balancing all people's rights, including those of trans people and of women, acknowledging that both groups have real, important and often shared concerns. On matters such as access to single-sex spaces, we understand these issues must be navigated sensitively. The government's position embodies a belief that it is both possible and essential to uphold protections for trans individuals whilst respecting women's concerns regarding privacy, safety and dignity. These were points also made very strongly and powerfully by the Honourable Member for Wolverhampton, my honourable friend, the Honourable Member for Wolverhampton West. And it is also important to recognise, and I want to underscore this, that nobody should be suffering and feeling the fear that so many do today. And it is so important to recognise how much words do matter. We recognise that for many trans individuals, the current climate is uncertain and has become, in too many places, hostile. The government is committed to ensuring that trans individuals are treated with dignity and respect. The statistics of hate crime and of sexual assault that have been shared in the debate today and of which we are aware is a matter that must be of concern to all. We are committed to equalising all existing strands of hate crime as aggravated offences to ensure that all LGBT+ people are fiercely protected under the law. Let me be unequivocal. Trans individuals deserve the right to live free from discrimination, violence and fear. There is no place for transphobia in our society, just as there is no place for homophobia or biphobia. Now, I understand the recent Supreme Court ruling in the For Women Scotland case has left many trans women feeling worried and concerned for their safety. I want to stress that there are also, rightly, laws in place to protect trans people from discrimination and harassment. That was true before the ruling, and the Supreme Court ruling also has underlined that fact. The Independent Equalities Regulator, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, as has been referred to in the debate today, is working to update its statutory code of practice, which will include advice for duty bearers on how to avoid discriminating against groups with protected characteristics, and has committed to seeking views from all affected stakeholders. This has been referred to in the debate today. The consultation on the draft, I will give way.
Does the Minister agree that 6 weeks is a very short amount of time for that consultation to be running? Initially it was 2 weeks. Wouldn't 12 weeks, as has been done for various different pieces of consultation that's been undertaken by the organisation, fit better with the big issues that we're talking about today?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and she will be aware that the consultation on the draft updated code opened today. What I will say is I recognise the consensus that 2 weeks was too short, and that people have already been contributing their views. And that the agreement that has been reached with the Secretary of State for a 6-week period, I hope now will be a longer period in which those that have already been putting together their views and sharing them will be a period in which they can take forward that consultation. There will be extensive consultation with stakeholders, and that everybody, including parliamentarians, will have the opportunity to contribute to that consultation. And we welcome the EHRC's commitment to ensure that diverse voices are included and will be listened to. It is important to also recognise that the final draft of the updated code will be laid in Parliament and will be subject to scrutiny and consideration by both houses in due course. Laws also remain in place to protect trans people. I will give way very briefly.
Thank you for giving way. Perhaps it's my ignorance, but can you explain the timeline in a bit more detail? When can we expect this to come to Parliament? And when do we expect the formal guidance to be agreed and issued? Thank you.
I thank my honourable friend for his contribution. Indeed, some of this also does depend on the EHRC's work and the time it takes to then respond to the consultation, which I know that we will all want them to do effectively. And it is a matter on which I'm sure that my honourable friend who is unable to be here today will be able to update the House in due course. But he will understand that on the one hand we're saying it needs to be longer, on the other hand we want to see that there is clarity. I think what is important is that it is a consultation in which all voices can be heard, and I think he will also appreciate the assurance that the updated code will be laid in Parliament and will be there for scrutiny and consideration by both houses, which will also be an important part of this process. I will give way very briefly.
Just on that point, I'm wondering, when she encourages her honourable friend to update us with this information about the timelines, could she also encourage her to update us with information on what the scrutiny process will be for that? I may have missed it, but I don't know if it's a negative or affirmative procedure or any of that. If some sort of statement could be made to the House explaining both those things, that would be really helpful for all of us.
I thank the honourable member for that contribution, and that is an important consideration, and I will raise this with the relevant minister, who's unable to be here. Indeed, laws also, Ms Furness, also remain in place to protect trans people from discrimination and harassment, as the Supreme Court itself pointed out and as I referenced earlier. And protections for gender reassignment under the Equality Act, it's important to state, have not been affected. I also want to make reference to the fact that the ruling does not impact the way a GRC is issued to legally change a person's legal sex for certain purposes, nor does it change its significance. There has been considerable debate on this, and so I will make some comments on this, but I'm sure members will understand that this will be an ongoing matter for debate. But it is important to recognise, and I think we have heard this in the debate, trans people deserve the right to get married, to have dignity in death, and to access pensions, live their lives in the same way that anyone else does. And indeed, we have said that we will look at gender recognition reform. Our immediate priorities, as has been laid out in the King's Speech this time, have been to make sure that we have trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices and strengthening protections from hate crime for trans people and improving their health care. But it is also important to recognise that discussions, of course, continue with trans organisations and the community, and those are discussions that my honourable friend, the Minister and the member for Llanelli, will continue to have. And now, any process that also allows people to change something as fundamental as their legal sex must have appropriate and proportionate checks and balances. I have heard the different views today, but it is important for me to state that the government does not support self-identification. The reason is, and I don't believe this will be new, it is because, as we believe, as we set out in our manifesto, in protecting the robustness of the process and with it legitimate applications, that medical diagnoses of gender dysphoria are important in these processes. What I have also heard, and we all have recognised this, is to recognise the challenges in accessing services under the NHS. And it is important to state that the government is committed to ensuring that trans people receive the health care and support that they need when they are accessing NHS services. There are delays that we all are aware of, and these have been going on for far too long. NHS England has increased the number of adult gender dysphoria clinics in England from 7 to 12. And it is, but it is also important to state that in light of the recommendations from the CAS report, report, NHS England also launched an in-depth review of adult services in August and set out details of that new review led by Dr David Levy. And this review will assess not only the quality, and that is the effectiveness and the safety and patient experience, but also the stability of each service and whether that existing service model is still appropriate for the patients that the services are caring for. I can also confirm that as part of our agenda supporting LGBT plus people, the government will deliver a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices, as I have referenced. The government is clear that conversion practices are abuse. They do not work and they can and do inflict deep and lasting harm on victims. That such acts continue to occur in our society, a society largely accepting of LGBT plus people, must be challenged. The previous government failed to act, and this government will not. That is why we have committed in the King's Speech to publishing draft legislation for a full inclusive ban on conversion practices, and we are working hard to draft measures which offer protection from these harmful practices, whilst also respecting the important role that teachers, religious leaders, parents, carers can have in supporting those exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity. So recent years, I will give way very briefly and then I'll conclude.
Conversion practices ban, looking again for an update on timelines for that and an update as well on what the scrutiny might look like of that. I understand it's been published in draft, which is very much appreciated. The Online Safety Act really benefited from being published in draft, but what scrutiny will happen and what is the timeline for the initial publication of the draft?
I thank the honourable member for her intervention. She may not be surprised to hear me say that, and indeed I would have I preempted her question. There isn't much I can update her on in that, other than to say it is a priority for my honourable friend, and when it is possible to bring forward an update to the House, she will very much want to be able to do that. But it is a priority and something she is continuing to work on. Indeed, Ms Furness, I spoke about Dr Levy's review very briefly in relation to adult gender services in NHS England, so that all trans people can get the high quality care they deserve. This was also referred to by my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow North. But I also just want to mention that we remain committed as well to implementing the recommendations set out in the CAS report, working with NHS England as they continue to improve children and young people's gender services and ensure that these services provide the right healthcare, safeguarding and support for children and young people. And that means making sure they're based on the best available evidence and expert clinical opinion. In relation to just briefly referencing the Supreme Court judgment again, I do so in the context of recognising that recent years have seen increasing focus on the definition of sex in the Equality Act and access to single-sex spaces. The Supreme Court has given their judgment on this point, and the government has been consistently clear that single-sex spaces must be protected. But we also know that trans people must be protected, and their safety and well-being is a matter for all of us. It is government and Parliament's role to protect all members of society, and I hope that the processes we have going forward, we can now work better together to do just that. I also want to make reference to the rainbow map. A number of honourable members have raised this today, and they are right to do so, because we were ranked first place in 2015. We went down to 22nd place this year. It is a matter of concern. The UK has long championed the rights of LGBT+ people at home and abroad, and we proudly uphold a clear and robust, expansive legal and legislative framework. We are working to advance the rights afforded to LGBT+ people, including bringing forward legislation, as we have spoken about today, in relation to conversion practices and strengthening protections against hate crime. And we recognise there is always more to do. So as we look forward to the future, this government's mission remains constant: to create a fairer, more inclusive society. This entails listening actively rather than imposing viewpoints, and it requires standing up for those who are marginalised, even when those actions prove politically difficult. And this debate has been an important contribution to that. More importantly, it involves remembering that the core principle that equality is not a zero-sum game. It elevates us all. We take pride in our achievements and our values, and we will not let complacency or the intent for division take root. Our commitment is to continue listening, to continue learning, and continue fighting for a society where everyone, regardless of their identity or whom they love, can live with safety, with dignity, and with hope. Thank you.
Dr. Savage to wind up.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the honourable members who've spoken in support of this petition today with understanding and with empathy. As a Liberal Democrat, one of my foremost values is to create a society in which people are able to lean into their full potential. In the past in this country, we've tried to force left-handed people to be right-handed, gay people to be straight, or otherwise punish people who deviate from the norm for being who they are. Let's not repeat that mistake by putting insuperable obstacles in the way of trans people. Today we've heard some people argue that about the rights of trans people versus the rights of women to have a safe space. This is very complex and in some contexts especially sensitive, but let's keep it in proportion. Trans people are a tiny percentage, and the vast majority of them just want to be able to live their lives peacefully. As already mentioned, being trans is not a lifestyle choice. It is a path that is difficult, onerous, and too often fraught with danger. It is not a mission that people undertake in order to gain access to single-sex spaces of the opposite sex. We as parliamentarians have a duty to get this right. This is literally vital when we hear about the terrible, tragic rates of suicide and mental health issues amongst trans people. And so today I'd like to leave the government with the following questions. What measures will they implement to reduce the current 7-year NHS waiting lists? What will they do to address the shockingly low prosecution rate for hate crimes against trans people? What will they be doing to ensure that tragic cases like Joelle's, who was left waiting a crucial 8 days for cancer treatment, never happen again? And to ensure that there is fairness and clarity for the trans community going forwards. Trans people in the UK are not asking for special treatment. They are simply asking to be seen, to be recognised, to be safe, to be treated with respect and dignity. And finally, I want to say to any trans person listening to this debate today, to know this: even in a political climate where your identity is too often debated rather than respected, there are people in this Parliament who will stand up for your right to live freely and authentically, to live into your full potential. We owe it to you to keep the focus where it belongs, on your humanity. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 701159 relating to transgender people self-identifying their legal gender. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.